we think we know the Second World War. We see the black and white images. We hear the stories of grand battles and famous generals. It was a global conflict from 1939 to 1945. It changed the world forever. But the history we learn is often just the surface. The real story is stranger. It is filled with bizarre plans, unlikely heroes, and deceptions so clever they sound like fiction. What if one of the most effective American units was an army of artists? What if a bear was officially enlisted as a soldier in the Polish army? What if the United States was attacked by thousands of bombs carried by balloons? The reality of the war was more complex and far more incredible than most people imagine. The official records and declassified documents show a conflict fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with imagination, trickery, and sometimes pure desperation. These are the stories from the margins, the footnotes of history, that are often more revealing than the headlines. Number 17. What if the most effective soldiers never fired a shot? There was a unit in the US Army that fought on the front lines in Europe. Its job was to face the German army directly, but this unit had no real guns. Its tanks were made of rubber, its soldiers were actors, and its goal was not to destroy the enemy but to fool them. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. This was an army of illusion. It was a traveling roadshow of deception. The unit consisted of about 1,100 men. They were a strange mix for a military outfit. They were artists, architects, sound engineers, and advertising designers. Before the war, they were creating ads on Madison Avenue or painting in art studios. During the war, they used their creative skills to save the lives of thousands of other soldiers. Their mission was tactical deception. They would impersonate other, much larger U.S. Army units to mislead the enemy. If the Allied command wanted the German army to think a big push was coming from the south, they would send in the Ghost Army. Their toolkit was straight out of a stage production. They had a fleet of inflatable tanks, cannons, and trucks. From a distance or from a reconnaissance plane, these rubber decoys looked exactly like the real thing. A handful of men could inflate an entire tank battalion in a few hours. They were light, weighing only about 90 pounds, so they could be moved around quickly to create the impression of a large, mobile force. The artist's touch was crucial. They didn't just plop the tanks in a field. They added fake tracks in the dirt. They made sure the positioning looked natural. As the artist and veteran Ellsworth Kelly, who served in the unit, later explained, it was all about visual credibility. But deception is more than just visuals. The Ghost Army also specialized in sound. They had massive speakers mounted on trucks. These speakers could blast the sounds of an army on the move from miles away. The sound engineers had spent months at Fort Knox recording the sounds of armored and infantry units. They had a whole library of audio effects. They could play the sound of a tank column arriving in the middle of the night, or the sound of soldiers building a pontoon bridge. From 15 miles away, the enemy would hear what sounded like tens of thousands of men and their equipment getting ready for an attack. The final piece of the puzzle was what they called spoof radio. Radio operators from the Ghost Army would mimic the communication style of the unit they were impersonating. Every unit had a unique way of talking on the radio, a sort of electronic fingerprint. The Ghost Army operators would create phony traffic, sending messages back and forth to make enemy intelligence believe a real headquarters was operating in the area. And to complete the illusion, actors in the unit would drive into nearby towns wearing the insignias of the division they were pretending to be. They would go to cafes and talk loudly, hoping local spies would overhear their fake plans. One of their most famous missions was Operation Viersen in March 1945. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, a huge and dangerous operation. The Ghost Army was sent in to draw attention away from the real crossing point. They impersonated two full divisions, about 30,000 men, with their inflatable tanks and sound effects. They made the German command believe a massive force was building up many miles south of the actual target. The deception worked. The German army repositioned some of its forces to meet the phantom threat, weakening the defenses at the real crossing point. Historians, like those in the official U.S. Army report on the unit, estimate that the Ghost Army's deception saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. The existence of the Ghost Army was a closely guarded secret. Their operations were classified for more than 40 years after the war ended. The men who served were told to never talk about it. It wasn't until a PBS documentary and the book The Ghost Army of World War II by Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales that their incredible story became public knowledge. Their battlefield was the enemy's imagination. They fought not with explosives, but with creativity. But even with the declassification, how much do we truly know? How many of their missions are still undocumented, lost in sealed government files? Did the German High Command ever suspect they were being fooled by a bunch of artists? And if so, did they create their own counter-deception units? And perhaps the most unsettling question are similar, more technologically advanced ghost armies in operation today, shaping conflicts in ways we can't even perceive. Number 16, could a bear really be a soldier? In the long and brutal history of warfare, animals have often played a part. Horses, dogs, and pigeons have all served alongside humans. But there is likely only one case of a bear being officially enlisted in an army, receiving a rank, and serving in combat zones. His name was Wojtek. The story begins in 1942 in Iran. Polish soldiers who had been released from Soviet captivity were making their way south to join the British forces in the Middle East. Along the way, they came across a young Iranian boy who had found an orphan Syrian brown bear cub. The soldiers took a liking to the small animal. One of the civilian refugees traveling with them, Irina Bokiewicz, bought the cub for a few tins of condensed milk. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish II Corps adopted him. They named him Wojtek, a common Slavic name that means he who enjoys war or smiling warrior. At first he was just a mascot. He was a morale booster for men who had lost everything. He was fed with condensed milk from an old vodka bottle. As he grew, his diet expanded. He loved marmalade, honey, and fruit. He also developed a taste for beer, which he would drink straight from the bottle, and cigarettes, which he would eat rather than smoke. He became a part of the company. He would wrestle with the soldiers, play in the camp, and ride in the passenger seat of their trucks, his head sticking out the window like a dog. He learned to salute when greeted. When the Polish forces were ordered to deploy from Egypt to Italy to fight in the brutal Italian campaign, there was a problem. The British authorities in the port of Alexandria would not allow a wild animal onto the transport ship. The Polish soldiers were determined not to leave their friend behind. The commanding officer came up with a simple, brilliant solution. He officially enlisted Wojtek into the army. He was given a paybook, a rank, and a serial number. He became Private Wojtek. As an official soldier, he was allowed to board the ship. In Italy, during the intense Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, Wojtek's role changed from mascot to active participant. At Monte Cassino was one of the toughest fights of the war. The soldiers of the 22nd Company were tasked with transporting heavy crates of artillery shells to the front lines. It was dangerous and exhausting work, often under fire. Wojtek, who was now a fully grown, powerful bear, started to help. He would watch his human comrades struggle with the heavy boxes. According to the accounts of his fellow soldiers, like Dmitry Shalugo, Wojtek started to copy them. He would walk over, stand on his hind legs, and hold out his paws. The soldiers would place a 100-pound crate of shells in his arms. He would then carry it to the artillery positions without ever dropping one. His contribution was so significant and so inspiring that the 22nd Company adopted a new emblem. It was a silhouette of a bear carrying an artillery shell. This became their official insignia, worn on their uniforms and painted on their vehicles. After the war, Wojtek, along with the rest of his unit, was demobilized in Scotland in 1947. He couldn't return to Poland, which was now under a different political system. He was given to the Edinburgh Zoo. He lived there until his death in 1963. His old Polish army buddies would visit him, sometimes jumping into his enclosure to wrestle with him one last time, much to the alarm of the zookeepers. The story of Wojtek sounds like a fable, but it is documented in the records of the Polish army and in the testimony of the men who served with him. The book, Wojtek the Bear Polish War Hero, by Aileen Orr, details his life based on these accounts. He was a symbol of hope and resilience for men far from home. He was a reminder of a gentler world in the middle of a brutal conflict, yet mysteries remain. Were there official military protocols written to manage an enlisted bear? How did the chain of command handle disciplinary issues or promotions for a non-human soldier? And beyond the official story, what other undocumented animal companions served in similar capacities, their stories lost because they were never given a rank and a serial number. Number 15. What if the enemy attacked with paper balloons? The continental United States was largely untouched by direct enemy attack during the war. There were a few German submarine attacks on coastal shipping, but the homeland felt safe, thousands of miles from the fighting in Europe and the Pacific. But what most Americans didn't know was that they were the target of a secret, silent, and bizarre bombing campaign. From late 1944 to early 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 bombs against North America. These bombs were not delivered by planes or submarines. They were carried across the Pacific Ocean by paper balloons. This was Japan's Fugo weapon, or fire balloon. It was a desperate and ingenious plan. Japanese scientists had discovered the existence of a strong, high-altitude air current that blew from west to east across the Pacific. This current, now known as the jet stream, was like a river in the sky. They realized they could use it to send bombs to America. The balloons themselves were a marvel of simple engineering. They were about 33 feet in diameter and made from mulberry paper, glued together with potato flour. They were filled with hydrogen. Attached to the balloon was a chandelier-like structure carrying a small number of incendiary or anti-personnel bombs. The most clever part was the altitude control system. The balloons needed to stay at an altitude of about 30,000 feet to remain in the jet stream. To manage this, they were equipped with a series of sandbags and a barometer. If the balloon dipped too low, the barometer would trigger the release of a sandbag, making the balloon lighter and causing it to rise. After all the sandbags were dropped, the same system would then release the bombs. A final self-destruct mechanism was designed to destroy the balloon and its equipment after the payload was delivered. The journey across the 5,000 miles of ocean took about 3 to 4 days. It was a silent, unmanned, and nearly invisible form of attack. Over 9,300 of these balloons were launched from sites on the main Japanese island of Honshu. The goal was twofold. First, they hoped the incendiary bombs would start massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, causing panic and diverting American resources to firefighting. Second, it was a psychological weapon, meant to prove that Japan could reach the American homeland. The first balloons were found in late 1944. They landed all across North America, from Alaska and Canada down to Mexico, and as far east as Michigan. The U.S. government immediately realized the potential for panic. If the public knew that bombs were randomly falling from the sky, it could cause widespread fear. The Office of Censorship stepped in. They asked newspapers and radio stations to not report on any balloon bomb incidents. The media complied, and a total news blackout was put in place. The government's strategy was to deny Japan any information about whether their strange weapon was working. Right? If the Japanese military heard no news reports of fires or explosions in America, they would assume the balloons were all failing. The plan to start massive forest fires mostly failed. The balloons arrived during the winter and early spring, when the forests of the Pacific Northwest were wet and snowy. However, the campaign was not without tragedy. In May 1945, in a remote part of Oregon, a minister's wife named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children from her church were on a picnic. They discovered one of the downed balloons. As they tried to move it, the anti-personnel bomb it carried exploded. They were the only known civilian casualties of enemy action in the continental U.S. during the war. After this incident, the government partially lifted the censorship to warn people not to touch strange objects they might find in the woods. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese military, hearing no reports of success and facing bombing raids that destroyed their hydrogen production facilities, shut down the Fugo program. They never knew how many of their balloons had actually made it. The U.S. government estimates that about 1,000 reached North America. It was a strange and little-known chapter of the war, a silent invasion from the sky. The story is detailed in books like Japan's World War II Balloon Bomb Attacks on North America by Robert C. McKeish. But what questions still linger? How many unexploded balloon bombs still lie hidden in the remote wilderness of North America? Geologists and forestry experts occasionally find remnants, but is it possible a live one is still out there? And more strategically, did the U.S. military secretly develop its own long-range, unconventional weapons based on the Japanese balloon concept with plans that are still classified today? Number 14. What if a dead body could change the course of a war? Espionage during the war was a world of codes, secret agents, and hidden information. But one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire conflict did not rely on a living spy. It relied on a dead one. The plan was audacious, macabre, and brilliant. It was called Operation Mincemeat. In 1943, the Allies were planning their next major move in Europe. They had successfully driven Axis forces out of North Africa. The logical next step was to invade southern Europe. The obvious target was Sicily. It was a direct route into Italy and the soft underbelly of Europe, as Winston Churchill called it. The problem was that the German High Command also knew Sicily was the obvious target. They were reinforcing the island heavily. A direct invasion would be incredibly costly in terms of lives and equipment. The Allies needed a way to convince the Germans that they were going to attack somewhere else. They needed a grand deception. This is where a British intelligence officer named Ewan Montagu and his team at the 20 Committee came in. Their job was to manage double agents and run deception campaigns. They came up with a wild idea. What if they could plant fake invasion plans on a dead body and make sure the enemy found it? The plan was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. First, they needed a body. They couldn't just use any dead person. It had to be someone whose cause of death could plausibly look like drowning after a plane crash. Through a London coroner, they obtained the body of a man named Glyndor Michael, a homeless man who had recently died from ingesting rat poison. The poison created effects similar to drowning, making the autopsy plausible. The team now had their vessel. Next, they had to create a completely new identity for him. They named him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They created a whole life for this fictional man. He was given an ID card, letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam, a letter from his father, ticket stubs from a London theater, and even a stern letter from his bank manager about an overdraft. Every detail was designed to make him seem real. The letters were written and rewritten to capture the right tone. They even had a woman from the office, Nancy Jean Leslie, pose as Pam for a photograph to be placed in his wallet. All of these personal items, known as pocket litter, were crucial. If the Germans found the body, they would scrutinize every single item. If anything seemed fake, the whole deception would collapse. The most important item was the briefcase that would be chained to Major Martin's wrist. Inside this briefcase were official-looking but completely fake documents. These documents, written as personal letters between high-ranking Allied generals, hinted that the main Allied invasion target was Greece and Sardinia, and that Sicily was just a feint to draw enemy forces away. The body of Major Martin, dressed in a Royal Marines uniform and carrying the briefcase, was placed in a special canister packed with dry ice. It was loaded onto the British submarine HMS Seraph. On April 30th, 1943, the submarine surfaced off the coast of Huelva, a small port in southern Spain. Spain was officially neutral, but had many German intelligence agents operating within its borders. The crew gently pushed the body into the water, letting the current carry it toward the shore. A few hours later, a Spanish fisherman found the body. The Spanish authorities recovered it. As the British had hoped, German intelligence in Spain was soon alerted. The Germans pressured the Spanish to let them see the contents of the briefcase. The Spanish eventually allowed it. The fake documents were carefully opened, photographed, and then returned, so the British would think the tampering was not discovered. The information was sent directly to the highest levels of the German command in Berlin. The German leadership fell for it completely. They believed they had intercepted the Allies' real invasion plans. They started moving troops and equipment away from Sicily to reinforce Greece and Sardinia. Panzer divisions vital for defending against an invasion were relocated. When the Allies finally launched the real invasion of Sicily on July 10th, 1943, known as Operation Husky, they met with lighter than expected resistance. The deception had worked perfectly. General Alexander, the Allied ground commander, later stated that Operation Mincemeat had saved thousands of lives. The story was told by Ewan Montagu himself in his 1953 book, The Man Who Never Was. But the success of Operation Mincemeat raises some deep questions. How did British intelligence know for certain that the Germans would trust the documents? Was there a high-level double agent in Berlin who confirmed the German leadership had taken the bait? And considering its success, how many other similar operations using human bodies for deception were planned or executed by either side? Their stories so dark they were never declassified. Number 13. What if an army was made entirely of women? The image of the soldier in the war is almost universally male, but on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had a different approach, born out of desperation and necessity. The country mobilized its entire population, and that included women. While women in other countries served in auxiliary roles, as nurses or factory workers, the Soviet Union was the first nation to allow women to serve in frontline combat roles. They were pilots, machine gunners, tank drivers, and most famously snipers. By the end of the war, over 800,000 women had served in the Red Army. They were not just filling in, they were fighting. This was a radical departure from the military traditions of the time. The government's propaganda presented them as heroes, defending the motherland. But the reality was grueling and dangerous. They faced the same horrors of combat as the men, and they often faced additional prejudice from their own male comrades. The most iconic of these female combatants were the snipers. The Central Women's Sniper Training School was established near Moscow. It trained over 1,000 female snipers. The military believed that women made good snipers. They thought women had greater patience, more delicate trigger control, and the resilience to endure the long, cold hours of waiting for a single shot. The women who came to these schools were often young, many still in their teens, driven by patriotism and a desire for revenge against the invading forces. The most famous of them all was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Before the war, she was a history student at Kiev University. When the German invasion began in 1941, she immediately volunteered. She had already earned a sharpshooter badge in a civilian program. The recruiting officer initially tried to push her toward being a nurse, but she insisted on joining the infantry. She was eventually assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. Her record was astonishing. In her first year of combat fighting in the brutal sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol, she was credited with 309 confirmed kills. This makes her the most successful female sniper in history. Her targets included 36 enemy snipers. Sniping is a deadly game of cat and mouse. To hunt another sniper, you have to be better, smarter, and more patient. Pavlichenko survived duels that lasted for days. She was wounded 4 times. Her reputation grew so large that the German army specifically targeted her, trying to kill the Russian bitch from hell, as they called her. In 1942, after being wounded by a mortar shell, she was pulled from combat. The Soviet government realized she was too valuable as a propaganda symbol to risk losing her. She was sent on a tour of the Allied countries, including the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. She was the first Soviet citizen to be welcomed at the White House by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She toured the country, giving speeches, trying to rally support for a second front in Europe. In America, she was met with a strange mix of fascination and sexism. Reporters asked her about her uniform, whether she wore makeup at the front, and why her skirt was so long. Annoyed, she famously told a crowd in Chicago, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Her story, and the stories of thousands of other Soviet women soldiers, is documented in Svetlana Alexievich's groundbreaking oral history, The Unwomanly Face of War. Alexievich interviewed hundreds of female veterans who told their stories of fear, courage, and the difficult return to civilian life, where their combat experience was often ignored or downplayed. They were a unique army, an army of women who proved that combat skill was not determined by gender. But their history is still not fully understood. How many women who served in combat roles were never officially recognized, their records listing them in non-combat positions? What was the true psychological toll on these women who had to navigate both the trauma of war and the societal expectations of their gender? And how did their male counterparts and enemies truly react to facing women in direct lethal combat on the battlefield? Number 12. Why was a popular soda invented by the other side? Well, Coca-Cola is a powerful symbol of American culture. It spread across the world, especially after the war, becoming a global brand. But during the conflict, one of the company's most famous products was actually created inside Germany because of the war itself. That product was Fanta. In the 1930s, Coca-Cola was incredibly popular in Germany. The man in charge of Coca-Cola's German operations was Max Keith. He was a dedicated company man. He built the German branch into a massive success. But when the war began in 1939, things got complicated. After the United States officially entered the war in 1941, Germany was declared an enemy nation. All trade between the US and Germany was cut off. This meant Max Keith could no longer get the secret 7X syrup needed to make Coca-Cola. Keith was in a tough position. His factories were still operational, but he had nothing to produce. He could have just shut everything down. But he was determined to keep the business alive and protect his employees. He needed a new drink. He couldn't make Coke, so he decided to invent something else using only the ingredients available in Germany at the time. The ingredients available during wartime were strange and limited. They were the leftovers, the scraps from other industries. Keith and his team started experimenting. They used things like whey, the watery liquid left over after making cheese. They used apple pomace, the fibrous stuff left after pressing apples for cider. They added in beet sugar, which was available in limited quantities. It was a bizarre concoction. The recipe changed constantly depending on what scraps they could find. They needed a name for this new drink. Keith told his sales team to use their imagination. In German, the word for imagination is Fantasy. One of the salesmen, Joe Knipp, immediately blurted out Fanta. The name stuck. Fanta was born. It was a caffeinated fruit-flavored soda, though the fruit flavor was often a mystery based on the available ingredients. It was sold in the classic Coke-style bottles. Fanta became surprisingly popular in wartime Germany. With other consumer goods being rationed or unavailable, it was one of the few sweet treats people could get. It was used not just as a drink, but also as a sweetener for soups and stews, as sugar was heavily rationed. Max Keith managed to keep the Coca-Cola Company's German plants running throughout the entire war by producing this substitute product. The story gets even more interesting. Keith himself was a complex figure. He operated his business under the German regime, which meant he had to make compromises. But according to historical accounts, like those detailed in Mark Pendergrass's book For God, Country, and Coca-Cola, Keith was not an ardent supporter of the ruling party. He fought against government efforts to take over his company. After the war, when the American military arrived, they investigated Keith. They found that he had kept the company afloat, protected his workers, and had not been a fervent supporter of the government. When the American Coca-Cola executives returned to Germany after the war, they were stunned to find their plants were not only intact but had been profitable. Max Keith handed the factories and the profits from Fanta back over to the parent company. Coca-Cola discontinued the German Fanta. But years later, in the 1950s, when Pepsi started to introduce new drink flavors, Coca-Cola remembered its strange wartime creation. They reformulated the recipe, making it the orange-flavored soda we know today, and launched Fanta internationally. The drink born out of wartime scarcity in Germany became a global brand, a part of the very company it was created to substitute for. But the story leaves us with some uncomfortable questions. How did Max Keith navigate the treacherous political landscape of the German state for so many years without being co-opted or shut down? What specific deals did he have to make? And in a broader sense, how many other major global corporations have similarly complex and morally ambiguous wartime histories that have been smoothed over and forgotten in their official brand stories? Number 11. Could you really build a bomb out of bats? Of all the secret weapon projects developed during the war, few were as strange as Project X-Ray. The plan was simple, yet bizarre, to attach tiny incendiary bombs to thousands of bats, drop them over Japanese cities, and have the bats roost in the wooden buildings. The bombs would then detonate, starting thousands of small fires simultaneously, creating chaos and overwhelming the firefighters. It was a plan to turn a small flying mammal into a weapon of mass destruction. The idea came from a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania named Lytle S. Adams. He was on a trip to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, which is home to millions of Mexican free-tailed bats. As he watched the massive cloud of bats emerge from the cave at dusk, an idea struck him. He knew that Japan's cities were largely built of wood and paper. He also knew that bats like to hide in dark, tight spaces, like the eaves and attics of buildings. What if you could arm them? In January 1942, just a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adams wrote a letter to the White House outlining his plan. Normally, such an idea would be dismissed as crazy. But in the desperate early days of the war, the government was open to any idea that might give them an edge. The letter made its way to President Roosevelt, who, according to a memo from the time, was intrigued. He approved the project, noting that this man is not a nut. The project was handed over to the U.S. Army Air Forces. A team of scientists was assembled. One of the key figures was Louis Fieser, the chemist who had invented napalm. His job was to create a tiny incendiary device that was light enough for a bat to carry. He developed a small canister weighing less than an ounce, filled with a napalm-like substance and a timed chemical fuse. The next challenge was the bats themselves. The scientists had to figure out which species was best. They needed a bat that was numerous, could carry a small payload, and hibernated. The hibernation part was key. The plan was to cool the bats down, forcing them into a dormant state. They could then be packed by the thousands into special bomb-like casings. And these casings would have parachutes. They would be dropped from a high-altitude bomber. As the casing fell, it would slowly warm up. The bats would wake up, the casing would open, and the bats would fly out and find places to roost in the city below. The timers on their tiny bombs would then go off. The project had its share of problems. During one test at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, some of the armed bats were accidentally released. They flew to the nearby airfield hangars and barracks and roosted. The subsequent explosions and fires burned the test range to the ground. As one of the project's official observers noted, it proved the weapon worked. The project was eventually passed from the Army to the Navy and then to the Marine Corps. By 1944, they had a workable system. They planned to use submarines to release the bat bombs off the coast of Japan. But by this time, another secret weapons project was nearing completion, the atomic bomb. The bat bomb project had already cost over $2 million. The military leadership decided to put all their resources into the atomic program. Project X-ray was canceled. The bat bomb was never used in combat. The full story is laid out in books like Bat Bomb World War II's Other Secret Weapon by Jack Cooper. The project was declassified, but it remains one of the strangest what-ifs of the war. What would have happened if it had been deployed? Could it have been as destructive as its designers hoped? And what other bizarre, nature-inspired weapon systems were developed in secret labs during the war, their files still buried so deep that their existence has been completely forgotten? Are there weaponized animals we know nothing about? Number 10. How long does a war really last for a soldier? The war in the Pacific officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri. For the world, the conflict was over, but for some Japanese soldiers scattered across the vast expanse of the Pacific Islands, the war did not end. They were cut off from communication, isolated in dense jungles. They never received the news of the surrender. They continued to fight a war that no longer existed. The most famous of these holdouts was Hiroo Onoda. Onoda was an intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. In December 1944, he was sent to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. His orders were to conduct guerrilla warfare and to never surrender. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, told him, "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." When American forces took the island in early 1945, Onoda and a few other soldiers melted into the jungle. They continued to follow their orders. They survived by eating coconuts, bananas, and stolen cattle from local farmers. They occasionally skirmished with local police and villagers. They saw leaflets dropped from planes announcing the end of the war, but they believed it was enemy propaganda, a trick to get them to surrender. They had been trained to be skeptical of such things. Years passed. The other soldiers with him were either killed in clashes or surrendered. By 1950, Onoda was with just 3 other men. They continued their mission. They repaired their rifles, maintained their uniforms, and conducted small raids. No, they were fighting a war in their own minds. In 1954, one of them, Shoichi Shimada, was killed. Another, Kinshichi Kazuka, was killed in 1972. By then, Onoda was completely alone. The Japanese government knew there were still holdouts. They sent search parties. They dropped leaflets with messages from their families. They left newspapers and letters. Onoda found all of them. But he always found a reason to disbelieve them. He saw a small detail that convinced him it was all a clever American trick. He was a highly trained intelligence officer, and his training was now working against him, trapping him in a state of perpetual war. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer and student named Norio Suzuki decided to travel the world. His personal checklist included finding Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He traveled to Lubang and wandered into the jungle. Incredibly, he found Onoda. He tried to convince him the war was over. Onoda listened, but refused to surrender. He said he would only lay down his arms if he received a direct order from his commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan with this information. He found Onoda's former commander, Major Taniguchi, who was now an old man working in a bookstore. The Japanese government flew Taniguchi to Lubang. In March 1974, Taniguchi, wearing his old uniform, met Onoda in the jungle. He stood before him and read the formal order of surrender. After 29 years, Hiroo Onoda's war was finally over. He surrendered his sword, his rifle, which was still in perfect working order, and some grenades. He returned to Japan a hero to some, a strange relic to others. He wrote an autobiography, No Surrender by 30-Year War. Onoda's story is an extreme example of duty and the psychological power of orders. He was not an isolated case. Another soldier, Taro Nakamura, was found on the Indonesian island of Morotai. Even later in 1974, there were reports of others for years after. This raises profound questions about the nature of war and reality. How many other soldiers on all sides of the conflict never psychologically came home, continuing to fight private wars long after the treaties were signed? What does it tell us about the human mind that a belief, an order, can be more powerful than overwhelming physical evidence? And could a soldier like Onoda exist today, in an age of global communication? Or have we created new kinds of information bubbles that could trap someone in a different kind of phantom war? Number 9. What if a city went to war with a UFO? In the early months of 1942, America was on edge. The attack on Pearl Harbor was fresh in everyone's memory. There was a real fear of a Japanese attack on the West Coast. The public was anxious, and the military was on high alert. This atmosphere of fear and uncertainty set the stage for one of the most bizarre and mysterious incidents of the war, the Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24 to 25, 1942, something happened in the skies over Los Angeles. It began with reports of an unidentified object in the sky. Air raid, sirens blared across the city, a total blackout was ordered. And then the shooting started. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade began firing their massive anti-aircraft guns into the night sky. Searchlights crisscrossed the darkness, trying to lock onto a target. For over an hour, the city was rocked by the sound of artillery. Over 1,400 shells were fired into the air. The next morning, the city was a mess. Buildings were damaged by falling shell fragments. The stress of the event caused at least 5 deaths from heart attacks and traffic accidents in the blackout. But there was one thing missing: an enemy plane. There was no evidence of any Japanese bombers. No downed aircraft were found. No bombs were dropped. The Japanese government later stated they had no planes over Los Angeles that night. So what were they shooting at? The official explanation put forth by the military at the time were nerves. They claimed that a weather balloon had been released, and its appearance, combined with the heightened state of anxiety, had triggered a chain reaction of panic among the gun crews. It was a case of mass hysteria, but many people didn't buy it. Eyewitnesses, including journalists, claimed they saw something in the sky. They described a large, slow-moving object that seemed to absorb the anti-aircraft fire without being damaged. The Los Angeles Times published a photograph that appeared to show searchlights converging on a distinct object in the sky. The incident sparked a huge controversy. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox initially called it a false alarm, but the War Department insisted that one or more aircraft were involved. The conflicting official statements only deepened the mystery. Was it a real attack that the government was covering up to avoid panic? Was it a secret American experimental aircraft that had gone off course? Years later, the Battle of Los Angeles would become a foundational event for UFO researchers. They pointed to the eyewitness accounts and the photograph as evidence of an extraterrestrial visitation. They argued that the object's ability to withstand a massive artillery barrage proved it was not of this world. The event is often cited in books and documentaries about the history of UFO sightings, but historians, like those at the California State Military Museum, have offered more down-to-earth explanations. They suggest the initial sighting was likely a Japanese reconnaissance plane launched from a submarine, a known Japanese tactic. This single plane, combined with the release of weather balloons and the general panic, could have created the illusion of a larger threat. The flashes and bursts in the sky that people saw were likely just the anti-aircraft shells exploding, their own fire being mistaken for an enemy. The truth of the Battle of Los Angeles is likely lost to the fog of war and time. It was a perfect storm of fear, confusion, and military action. It showed how easily a situation can spiral out of control in a climate of high anxiety, but the event leaves behind tantalizing questions. If the government's initial explanation of war nerves was the whole truth, why did they later release conflicting reports? Was the famous photograph doctored, or does it truly show an unexplainable object in the sky? And is it possible that the entire incident was a deliberately staged event by the U.S. military to test its air defense systems and gauge public reaction to an attack, a drill so realistic that even the participants didn't know it was fake? Or number 8. Could a pigeon guide a missile? The search for precision-guided weapons is a central theme of modern warfare. Today, we have laser-guided bombs and GPS-guided missiles. But during the Second World War, the technology was far more primitive. Bombs were dropped by eye with very little accuracy. The U.S. military was desperate for a way to make their bombs smarter, and one of the country's most famous psychologists came up with a truly revolutionary and completely bizarre solution: use pigeons. The idea came from B.F. Skinner. Skinner is one of the fathers of behaviorism, a school of psychology that focuses on how behavior is shaped by rewards and punishments. He had spent years studying how to train animals to perform complex tasks through a system of positive reinforcement. He believed he could apply these principles to guide a bomb. The project, officially called Project Pigeon, later renamed Project Orcon for organic control, began in 1943. The concept was strange but scientifically sound. A pigeon would be placed inside the nose cone of a missile or glide bomb. In front of the pigeon would be a small screen that showed an image of the target projected through a lens at the front of the bomb. The pigeon would be trained using food as a reward to peck at the image of the target on the screen. The screen was connected to the bomb's guidance fins. If the pigeon pecked in the center of the screen, the bomb would fly straight. If the target image drifted to the left, the pigeon would peck on the left side of the screen to get its food reward. This pecking would send a signal to the guidance fins, steering the bomb back to the left and recentering the target. The pigeon, in effect, became a living, breathing guidance system. To improve reliability, Skinner's final design used 3 pigeons, each in their own compartment, all pecking at the same target. The bomb's course would be determined by the majority vote of the 3 birds. Skinner and his team successfully trained the pigeons. They could track ships, buildings, and other targets with remarkable accuracy. They were not disturbed by noise, pressure changes, or the chaos of a simulated combat environment. As long as they could see the target, they would keep pecking. In a demonstration for military officials, Skinner showed them a simulated missile with a pigeon inside. He projected an image of a target. The pigeon flawlessly tracked it. Then, to prove the pigeon's focus, the scientists and military brass all tried to distract it, but the bird kept pecking. Despite the successful demonstrations, the military was skeptical. The idea of trusting a multi-million-dollar weapon to a bird just seemed too strange, too unreliable. As Skinner noted in his writings, they had a hard time taking the project seriously. The project was eventually canceled in 1944. The military decided to put its resources into other, more conventional guidance systems like radar. But the story didn't end there. The project was revived briefly by the Navy in 1948, but was ultimately canceled for good in 1953. The era of electronic guidance systems had begun, and the pigeon-guided bomb became a strange footnote in the history of military technology. Skinner always maintained that his system would have worked. He felt that the military's prejudice against the unconventional had prevented a major breakthrough. The details of the project are preserved in his papers and in historical accounts of military research. The failure of Project Pigeon raises some fascinating questions. Was the decision to cancel it based on sound military science, or was it simply a failure of imagination on the part of the leadership? If the project had been approved, could a fleet of pigeon-guided bombs have changed the course of the war in the Pacific? And what other seemingly absurd animal-based weapon systems were proposed and tested in secret, their files deemed too embarrassing or strange to ever be declassified? Number 7. What happens when you bomb a neutral country by mistake? Switzerland is famous for its neutrality. It remained neutral throughout the war, a small island of peace surrounded by conflict. But being neutral didn't mean it was safe. The war often spilled over its borders, and on several occasions, Switzerland found itself under attack from the Allied forces, specifically the United States Army Air Forces. These were not deliberate attacks, they were mistakes, but they were deadly mistakes that highlight the chaos and confusion of aerial warfare. Throughout the war, Allied bombers flying on massive raids into Germany and Austria would sometimes get lost or damaged. Flying at high altitude, often in bad weather and under enemy fire, it was easy for navigators to make mistakes. Switzerland, bordering both Germany and German-occupied France, was right next to the flight path for many of these missions. A small navigational error could put a bomber group over a neutral Swiss city instead of their intended German target. The most serious incident occurred on April 1st, 1944. A group of American B-24 Liberator bombers were supposed to be bombing Ludwigshafen am Rhein, a city in Germany. But due to high winds and navigational errors, the formation drifted far off course. They ended up over the northern Swiss city of Schaffhausen. Believing they were over their target, they dropped their bombs. Over 40 Swiss civilians were killed, and the city was heavily damaged. The reaction was immediate. The Swiss government protested furiously. The American government was deeply embarrassed. They issued a formal apology and promised to pay reparations. The U.S. military launched an investigation. They found it was a tragic accident, a combination of bad weather, equipment failure, and human error. But this was not an isolated incident. There were dozens of smaller bombings of Swiss territory throughout the war. Swiss cities like Zurich and Basel were also hit, resulting in more casualties. The Swiss did not just sit back and let this happen. Their own small air force would often fly up to intercept Allied bombers that violated their airspace. They would try to force them to land at Swiss airfields where the crews would be interned for the rest of the war. Sometimes this led to combat. Swiss fighter planes would shoot down American bombers that refused to comply or that they mistook for German aircraft. This created a strange and tense situation where a neutral country was in active, if limited, combat with one of the Allied powers. The story is a reminder that the lines on a map are invisible from 25,000 feet. The fog of war is not just a metaphor, it's a literal reality for pilots and navigators trying to find a specific target in a vast landscape, all while being shot at. The accidental bombings of Switzerland show how easily things can go wrong. The events are documented in Swiss archives and in U.S. military investigation reports. The U.S. eventually paid millions of dollars in reparations to Switzerland after the war, but the official explanation of navigational error has always been questioned by some. Were some of these bombings truly accidental? Some historians have suggested that certain attacks may have been subtle warnings to Switzerland to stop its economic cooperation with Germany. The Swiss were selling industrial goods and providing banking services to the German war effort, a fact that angered the Allies. Could a few. Stray bombs have been a way to send a message without a formal declaration of war. The official records say no, but the questions persist. How much pressure was really being applied to the Swiss behind the scenes? And how many other accidents of war in other neutral countries were actually deliberate acts of political intimidation, their true purpose hidden under a veil of plausible deniability? Number 6. What if the enemy leader's nephew fought against him? The war was full of strange ironies, but perhaps none is more striking than the story of William Patrick Hitler. He was the nephew of the German leader, and he served in the United States Navy fighting against his uncle's regime. William Patrick Hitler was born in Liverpool, England in 1911. His father was Alois Hitler Jr., the German leader's half-brother. William grew up in England, but as a young man he moved to Germany in the 1930s, hoping to use his famous last name to get a good job. His uncle, who was by then in power, did not like his English nephew. He called him my loathsome nephew. But he did help him get a few low-level jobs. William was not satisfied. He tried to blackmail his uncle, threatening to sell embarrassing family stories to the press if he didn't get a better position. This only made his uncle angrier. Feeling threatened, William fled Germany and returned to England in 1938. In 1939, just before the war started, William and his Irish mother, Bridget, went to the United States for a lecture tour. They were sponsored by the newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst. They traveled the country giving talks about William's famous and powerful uncle and the family's history. You know, when the war broke out, they were stranded in the U.S. They settled in Queens, New York. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, William wanted to join the fight. He tried to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1942, but he was rejected because of his name and his family connections. He was in a strange position. He despised his uncle and what his government stood for, but his name made him an object of suspicion. Determined to serve, William wrote a letter directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the letter, he explained his situation and made a passionate plea to be allowed to join the American military. The letter was passed to the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who conducted a background check. After a thorough investigation, the authorities decided that William's desire to fight against his uncle's regime was genuine. In 1944, he was cleared for service. He was inducted into the U.S. Navy. He served as a pharmacist mate. He was wounded in action and received the Purple Heart Medal. He served honorably until he was discharged in 1947. For him, fighting in the U.S. Navy was a way to fight against the legacy of his family name. It was a way to prove his loyalty to his new country and to atone for the actions of his famous relative. After the war, William Patrick Hitler wanted to disappear. He wanted to live a quiet, anonymous life. He changed his last name to Stuart Houston. He married, had 4 sons, and ran a small business in Long Island, New York, that analyzed blood samples for hospitals. He rarely spoke about his past. He wanted to leave the name and the history behind. His story was known to some historians, but was not widely publicized until many years later, partly through David Gardner's book, The Last of the Hitlers. The story of William Patrick Hitler is a powerful reminder that history is not just about grand armies and ideologies. It's about individual people and the strange paths their lives take. It raises some fascinating questions. What kind of intelligence, if any, did U.S. authorities gather from William about his uncle's personality and family background? Did his presence in the U.S. Navy have any propaganda value that was never made public? And how did his fellow sailors react when they discovered the identity of the man serving alongside them? Was he accepted, or was he forever an outsider? Number 5. Were there secret enemy bases in North America? The idea of a German military presence in North America during the war seems impossible. The Atlantic Ocean was a massive barrier, controlled by the Allied navies. But the German military did manage to establish a secret, unmanned base on the continent. It wasn't an invasion force. It was a weather station. In modern warfare, weather is a critical piece of intelligence. Accurate weather forecasts are essential for planning naval operations, air raids, and troop movements. The weather in the North Atlantic, where much of the naval war was fought, generally moves from west to east. This gave the Allies a huge advantage. They had weather stations all over North America and Greenland. They could see the weather systems coming. The Germans, on the other hand, were in a weather-blind position. They had very little information about the weather developing in the west. To solve this problem, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, tried several solutions. They used weather ships and submarines to send back reports, but these were vulnerable to attack. They needed an automated secret solution. This led to the creation of the Wetterfunkgerät-Land, or WFL, an automatic weather station. It was a sophisticated piece of technology for its time. It was a collection of instruments that could measure temperature, wind speed, and barometric pressure. It would then automatically encode this data and transmit it via shortwave radio every few hours. The whole system was powered by nickel-cadmium batteries. In September 1943, the German submarine U-537 was sent on a secret mission. Its goal was to deploy one of these WFL stations in North America. The chosen location was the northern tip of Labrador, in what is now part of Canada. The site was remote and uninhabited. On October 22, 1943, the submarine crew, along with a team of meteorologists led by Dr. Kurt Sommermeyer, went ashore. They assembled the weather station, which consisted of a 33-foot antenna and several canisters containing the instruments and batteries. To disguise it, they stenciled the name of a non-existent Canadian military company on the canisters. They even scattered empty American cigarette packs around the area to further the deception in case it was discovered. They named the station Weather Station Kurt. The station worked. For a few months, it transmitted valuable weather data back to Germany. However, it stopped transmitting for unknown reasons after a short time. Its existence remained a complete secret. The Allies never knew it was there. The local Inuit population knew of its existence, but did not know what it was. The story of the secret weather station was forgotten in the chaos of the end of the war. It wasn't until the late 1970s that its story was rediscovered. A retired engineer named Franz Selinger was writing a history of the German Weather Service and came across some old documents and photographs mentioning the station. In 1981, he went to Labrador with a team from the Canadian Department of National Defense and found the remains of the station. The canisters and the antenna masts were still there, rusted but intact. The station is now on display at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. This small, forgotten operation highlights the global nature of the war and the importance of information. It shows the lengths the German military would go to get a small strategic advantage, but it also raises some questions. Was Weather Station Kurt the only one? The Germans produced over 24 of these WFL units. Were others deployed in other remote parts of North America, Greenland, or even on remote Arctic islands, their locations still unknown? Could there still be remnants of secret German military technology lying undiscovered in the vast Canadian wilderness? And did this weather data contribute to any specific German military successes, like U-boat attacks, that we have previously not understood? Number 4, did the Allies have their own superweapons program? We often hear about the secret weapons programs of the German military, the V-2 rockets and the jet fighters. But the Allied powers were also working on their own terrifying and unconventional weapons. One of the most secret and disturbing of these was the British plan to use anthrax as a weapon of mass destruction. The British biological weapons program was based at a top-secret research facility at Porton Down in Wiltshire. In the early 1940s, British scientists, fearing that Germany might be developing its own biological weapons, began to research the offensive capabilities of deadly pathogens. The most promising agent they found was anthrax. Anthrax is a bacterium that is incredibly hardy and lethal. Its spores can survive for decades in the soil. If inhaled, it causes a rapid and almost always fatal illness. The British plan was called Operation Vegetarian. The idea was to drop anthrax-laced cattle cakes over Germany. These small cakes, made of linseed, would be eaten by cattle. The cattle would become infected with anthrax and die. The disease would then spread from the dead cattle to the human population, causing a massive epidemic. It would not only kill huge numbers of people, but also contaminate the German food supply and agricultural land for generations. It was a form of total war, aimed at destroying the enemy's ability to feed itself and exist. To test the weapon, the British needed a remote and isolated location. They chose Gruinard Island, a small, uninhabited island off the coast of Scotland. In 1942 and 1943, scientists from Porton Down conducted a series of tests on the island. They brought a flock of sheep to the island. Then, a bomb filled with a particularly virulent strain of anthrax called the Volume 14,578 strain was detonated upwind of the sheep. The results were terrifyingly effective. The sheep began to die within days. The test proved that an anthrax bomb was a viable and incredibly deadly weapon. The British government ordered 5 million of these anthrax cattle cakes to be produced. They were ready to be loaded onto bombers and dropped on Germany if the German military ever used biological or chemical weapons against Britain. The weapon was a deterrent, a line that would be crossed only in retaliation. Fortunately, that line was never crossed. The anthrax cakes were never used. After the war, they were destroyed in an incinerator. But the story of Gruinard Island was not over. The anthrax spores from the tests had contaminated the island so thoroughly that it was deemed uninhabitable. It was quarantined and declared off-limits to the public. For almost 50 years, it was one of the most dangerous and deadly places on Earth. In the 1980s, a complex and expensive cleanup operation was undertaken. The most contaminated topsoil was removed, and the island was sprayed with a solution of formaldehyde and seawater to kill the remaining spores. In 1990, the island was finally declared safe, and the quarantine was lifted. The story of Operation Vegetarian and Gruinard Island, detailed in books like The Biology of Doom by Ed Regis, is a chilling reminder of how close the world came to biological warfare. It shows that the development of weapons of mass destruction was not limited to one side. This secret history leaves us with some deeply troubling questions. How many other offensive biological weapons programs were running in secret Allied labs, and what other deadly pathogens were weaponized? What were the protocols for using these weapons, and how close did the world really come to the decision to deploy them? And perhaps most chillingly, are there other forgotten Gruinard Islands in remote corners of the world, test sites for secret weapons that are still dangerously contaminated, their locations lost to history? Number 3. How did the war change your pocket? The war was a massive engine of technological innovation. It produced jet engines, radar, and the atomic bomb. But it also had a huge impact on the small, everyday objects that we use without a second thought. Many of the simple items in our homes and pockets have their roots in the laboratories and factories of the war. Consider the ballpoint pen. Before the war, most people used fountain pens, but fountain pens had a major problem: they leaked at high altitudes. For the pilots of the Royal Air Force flying high-altitude bombing raids over Europe, this was a real issue. Their pens would leak ink all over their maps and logbooks. A Hungarian newspaper editor named Laszlo Biro had invented a new type of pen that used a tiny ball bearing to roll a thick, quick-drying ink onto paper. The British government saw the potential. They bought the patent, and the Biro pen was produced for RAF pilots and navigators. It didn't leak at altitude. After the war, the technology became public, and the ballpoint pen replaced the fountain pen for everyday use. Another common item born from the war is superglue. In 1942, a scientist named Dr. Harry Coover was working for Eastman Kodak. His team was trying to create a clear plastic for gun sights. They were working with a class of chemicals called cyanoacrylates. They found that these chemicals were a complete failure for gun sights because they stuck to everything. They were incredibly adhesive. The project was abandoned. Years later, after the war, Coover and his team were working on a new material for jet canopies. They once again experimented with cyanoacrylates, and they once again discovered their incredible sticking power. This time they realized they hadn't found a material for canopies, they had found a new kind of adhesive. The substance was eventually marketed as super glue. Even something as simple as duct tape has its origins in the war. The military needed a strong, flexible, waterproof tape that could be used for everything from repairing equipment to sealing ammunition cases. A division of Johnson & Johnson developed a new tape made from a rubber-based adhesive applied to a durable fabric backing. The soldiers called it duct tape because it was waterproof, like a duck's back. Its official military color was olive green. After the war, it was marketed to civilians for home repairs, and the color was changed to the familiar silver gray to match ductwork. The list goes on. The microwave oven was a direct result of radar technology developed during the war. A scientist named Percy Spencer was working on radar equipment when he noticed a candy bar in his pocket had melted. He realized the microwaves used in the radar could be used to cook food. The first commercial microwave oven was called the Radarange. The first computers were developed to break enemy codes. Even canned Spam, the processed meat product, became famous during the war as a staple food for soldiers. The war created a unique set of problems that required immediate, practical solutions. This pressure accelerated the process of invention and discovery. The technologies and materials developed for military purposes found new life in the consumer world after 1945. It's a strange legacy. The same global conflict that caused so much destruction also indirectly led to the creation of many of the convenient items that define modern life. But this connection raises some interesting questions. How many other common consumer products have their origins in classified military research that has never been made public? Is the technology in our smartphones or our cars based on secret military projects from decades ago? And does the process of military innovation, driven by the need to defeat an enemy, create a different kind of technology than innovation driven by consumer demand? Number two, was food the most powerful weapon? When we think of the American contribution to the war, we think of the arsenal of democracy, we think of the millions of tanks, planes, and ships that were produced in American factories. But there was another equally important arsenal, the American farm. The United States didn't just arm the Allied world, it fed it. The sheer scale of American food production during the war was a strategic weapon, as powerful as any bomber fleet. Before the U.S. entered the war, President Roosevelt knew that food would be critical. In 1941, he initiated the Lend-Lease Act. This program allowed the U.S. to supply its allies, primarily Great Britain and the Soviet Union, with war materials. And a huge part of that material was food. Great Britain, an island nation, was being starved by German U-boat attacks on its shipping. The Soviet Union had lost much of its best farmland to the German invasion. Both nations were facing a food crisis. The American farmer was asked to step up, and they did. Despite the fact that millions of farm workers had left to join the military or work in city factories, food production in the U.S. soared. This was achieved through a combination of mechanization, better fertilizers, and sheer hard work. The government encouraged this with slogans like, "Food will win the war and write the peace." On the home front, every American was asked to contribute. The government launched the Victory Garden program. People were encouraged to plant gardens in their backyards, on rooftops, and in public parks. These small private gardens produced an astonishing amount of food. By 1944, an estimated 20 million Victory Gardens produced about 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. This freed up the large commercial farms to produce food for the military and for the Lend-Lease program. The logistics of this global food operation were immense. Food was dehydrated, canned, and processed to make it last for the long journey across the oceans. The U.S. sent billions of dollars worth of food to its allies. They sent tons of flour to Britain, allowing them to maintain their bread ration. They sent huge quantities of canned meat, like the famous tushonka, a type of stewed pork, to the Red Army. Soviet soldiers often referred to the American-supplied food, along with the trucks and tanks, as a key reason they were able to keep fighting. This massive food program was not just about feeding soldiers, it was about preventing the collapse of the Allied home fronts. It kept British and Soviet factory workers fed, allowing them to continue producing weapons. It boosted morale. It was a form of soft power, a demonstration of America's incredible industrial and agricultural might. The story of this effort is captured in historical works like A Wartime Food Diary by a British housewife, which details the importance of American food shipments. The American food weapon was a key, but often overlooked part of the Allied victory, right? It kept the Allied coalition together and fighting. It was a war won not just on the battlefield, but also in the fields and farms of the American heartland. But this incredible mobilization of food production raises some deep questions. How did the shift to industrial scale agriculture during the war permanently change the American landscape and diet in the decades that followed? Did the reliance on American food give the United States a new kind of political leverage over its allies that lasted long into the Cold War? And how much of the food sent overseas was lost to submarine warfare? A number that is incredibly difficult to track but represents a massive hidden cost of the war. Number 1. Who were the witches of the night sky? On the brutal Eastern Front, German soldiers had a special name for a particular threat from the sky. They called them Nächtwechseln, the night witches. This was not a mythical creature. It was the nickname for the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Forces. They were a group of female pilots who flew thousands of daring and borderline suicidal bombing missions against the German army. The regiment was formed in 1941 at the suggestion of Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator. It was one of 3 female air combat units created at the time. The women who joined were young, most between the ages of 17 and 26. They were all volunteers eager to defend their country. The planes they flew were not advanced fighters. They flew the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane made of wood and canvas. It was an old, obsolete plane designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and training aircraft. It was slow, with a top speed slower than most German fighter planes. It had an open cockpit exposing the pilots to the freezing cold of the Russian winter. The plane had no radar, no radio, and very little armor. It was a flying antique. But the women of the 588th turned the weaknesses of their plane into a strength. They flew their missions exclusively at night. Their plane was so slow that its stall speed was lower than the stall speed of the German fighters, making it very difficult for the faster planes to shoot them down. The Po-2 was also very maneuverable. Their tactic was terrifyingly effective. They would fly in groups. As they approached the target, they would cut their engines and glide silently toward their bombing run. The only sound the German soldiers on the ground would hear was a soft whooshing noise, which they said sounded like a witch's broomstick. This is how they got their nickname. This silent approach gave the soldiers on the ground almost no warning. The pilots would drop their small bombs, restart their engines, and fly back to base. The missions were incredibly dangerous. The planes were flimsy and could be brought down by machine gun fire. They could only carry a small bomb load, so to be effective, each crew had to fly multiple missions every night. It was not uncommon for a crew to fly 8 or more missions in a single night, returning to a muddy, makeshift airfield only to refuel, rearm, and take off again. By the end of the war, some pilots had flown over 1,000 missions. The unit as a whole flew over 24,000 combat sorties. They were a decorated unit, and many of their pilots became heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. But they still faced prejudice. They were initially given old, worn-out uniforms and equipment. Their male counterparts in the Air Force sometimes treated them with disdain. But their combat record spoke for itself. They proved that women could be elite combat pilots. Their story is told in books like A Dance with Death Soviet Air Women in World War II by Anne Noggle. The Night Witches were a unique and fearsome fighting force, born out of a country's desperate struggle for survival. They used outdated technology and incredible courage to become a legend of the Eastern Front. Yet, their legacy leaves us with critical questions. How many of the individual stories of these women have been lost, their heroism subsumed into the larger narrative of the Soviet war effort? Did their success have any lasting impact on the role of women in the Soviet military after the war? Or was it a temporary wartime measure that was quickly reversed? And what other all-female combat units existed on other fronts in other armies, whose stories are even less known than those of the celebrated Night Witches?